Hello. For my 20-minute lecture presentation of history topic, I choose to talk about the origin of jazz music. This is a 20-minute lecture and it is designed to be the very first class of the 1-year, 2-semester jazz history required courses for undergrad students. So the very first lecture of all the history topics, I'm planning to do an introductory overview of the earliest period of jazz. For this class, I would like to quickly introduce the earliest period of jazz history, the earliest jazz figure, and the earliest recording. And after that, I'm gonna talk about the birth of jazz and the jazz connection with West African and European music. So most history classes and history books introduce topics in chronological order, and they usually start with early jazz period, which is 1900 to 1930, and later to the swing era, bebop, cool jazz, hard bop, modality music, and at last the avant-garde fusion. So the first and earliest period of jazz is generally considered the early jazz or pre-jazz, which is during the time period from 1900 to 1930. This period is known for its music style with unique performing tradition, featuring a highly unusual polyphonic technique called collective improvisation. And this style is known as New Orleans jazz or Dixieland jazz. For the earliest figure that plays New Orleans, born the first and archetypical legend in jazz, Buddy Bolden, in 1877, he turned to music full-time in about 1901 or 1902. Although his career as musician and band leader, it lasted no more than 11 years. But he earned the respect of almost every black musician as well as a large public following. He is generally considered as the first jazz celebrity, and he is also the father figure of which the New Orleans story is grounded. And consequently, the distinction of making the first jazz records went to a white New Orleans group, the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which is in February 1917. This band recorded this novelty song, Liberally Stable Blues, in 1917, and this is perhaps the date that the general public first began to hear about jazz music, not only because of the first jazz recordings recorded by this band, but also its debut in New York at Rayson Weber's Cabaret on Columbus Circle. Before moving on to the later part of the history in the New Orleans period, there are also a lot of the history, about the research before the 1900, which is before the earliest jazz figure and the earliest jazz recording. As we all know, the original Dixieland Jazz Band, it consists of 5 white musicians. Their huge success of making recordings which sold in millions. And the reason for that is because of playing in the right spot at the right time and hitting the headlines from coast to coast. Liberally Stable Blues music is recorded by the Victor Talking Machine Company. Actually, before inviting the original Dixieland Jazz Band, 1 year before that, in 1916, the company invited Freddie Kipler, who was perhaps the first jazz figure from New Orleans, who traveled widely He left New Orleans and performed in different places to perform jazz music. He was invited to make test discs to see how jazz music sounds on record. But he refused because he didn't want to document his music, because he don't want other people to steal his music. Freddie was also sad. Freddie was sad to play with handkerchief over his hand to cover his fingerings, so other musicians couldn't see his fingerings. So Freddie didn't got a chance to record the first jazz recording. But stealing music always exists. According to trombonist Preston Jackson, the original Dixieland jazz band was just imitating the music of Joe Oliver in New Orleans. And the funny thing was, this band, the original Dixieland jazz band, they stopped playing jazz, no longer playing jazz in 1922. They started playing something else. They played commercial foxtrots later in their career, simply because there was more money in it. So, did Buddy Bowden invent jazz? Probably not. Buddy Bowden, he was an improviser, and he left no written music. There is now only one photo left of Buddy Bowden. And in this old photo, ancient photo, he is pictured standing second from the left with his band. And it is because of the shortage of primary source documents and a lack of reliable evidence. Much of those jazz musicians' earliest musicians' legend comes from oral accounts which passed down. This is an 1890 issue of the New Orleans Mascot, which depicts white citizens pleading for mercy as a black band hired to advertise a museum performs some kinds of music. So the mascot, it is a weekly mascot which began publication in 1882, and it was issued each Saturday at a price of 5 cents. What we can know from this poster, from this cover of newspaper, we can know that from this photo, musicians are black musicians, and they are playing some kind of stuff, music which is unusual enough, which provoke outrage and confusion. And also they are performing without any sheet music. And we can also see there are three playing bass instruments, three playing brass instrument, and one on the bass drum. And the music they are producing music that has power to send the white citizens into panic and imploring the band to stop. This weekly newspaper, it was published in 1890, which was 5 years before Bowden ever performed in the public. And we can know during this time period, before Buddy Bowden ever performed in public, before 1900, the demand for music was already so great. Musicians already started working together. They started to provide a broad range of functional music. They started playing for picnics, concerts, dances, funerals, and they performed for public events. The origin of jazz must be way ago, before the first recording, before the first documented jazz figure. Before 1900, before the New Orleans jazz, before the first period in the textbook, we shouldn't realize that jazz is already there. Jazz is not invented by anyone. Jazz music It's a lot easier to recognize than to describe. Jazz is the result of 300-year-old blending in the United States of two great musical traditions. It is because of the blending of the European and West African music. And that's why New Orleans has its special place in jazz history, because of the unique combination which led to the birth of this new music happened there. So the blending of these two kind of music and the transition of West African culture and European music, the transition didn't happen easily. The West African influence survived very hard. It had a hard time surviving in New Orleans it's through two ways. It's through private voodoo ceremonies and public performance in Congo Square. We can tell from the engaging rhythm which identify jazz music, it came from the West Africa. Because in the European music, there's no intensity and complexity of the rhythm. And for classical musicians, for people who perform classical music, you don't need a highly developed metronome sense. And European music, the music places primary emphasis upon the upbeat and the downbeat 4/2 bar. But for jazz music, the metronome sense, that's very important. And understanding and enjoying rhythmic complexity is entirely a matter of training, because nobody is born with a fine sense of the rhythm. The main instrument of West African music is the drum. It is usually a set of 3 drums or even more. And the music is polyrhythmic, and there are usually 2 or more separate rhythms being played at the same time, sometimes even 5 or 6 different rhythms. The only difference between European music and West African music is that European music is a little bit more complicated harmonically, and African music is more complicated in rhythm. And usually modulation from key to key is hardly seen in African music, and we don't see European music have multiple meters. And here are some history documents. This is the Black Code of 1724, which forbade all forms of worship except Catholicism. And in 1782, Governor Galvez banned the admissions of Negroes from Martinique because they practiced voodoo. And they said voodoo will make the lives of the citizens unsafe. And in 1803, voodoo was spreading, and it spreads even among white people. In 1803, Louisiana Purchase lifted all restrictions and immigration boomed. In 1817, the Sunday dance of the slaves in Congo Square was finally legalized. And this kind of dance, this kind of music tradition was dancing, also became a tourist attraction. The very first legend in jazz, Charles Bodin, was probably almost 8 years old when the dance at Congo Square came to an end. Buddy knew about the voodoo music, and he definitely attended those Congo meetings, And Buddy mastered a European instrument, the cornet. So It is because he grew up during the brass band craze, and all these different kinds of music influence helped to establish a new kind of music, which is later jazz. Comparing to West African music, which survived secretly in voodoo and Congo Square, European music and European musical instruments, they survived so much easier because of the tremendous popularity of the military band. Music of the military band originally came from France, and parades and concerts. It later became America's favorite outdoor sports, and also because of New Orleans is a former colony of France, so this city followed a lot of French tradition and French fashion in military bands. And military bands were employed on almost all occasions: picnics, concerts, riverboat executions, dance, and funerals. New Orleans also has a special kind of organizations which can give all these bands employment. That's everything for today. Talk about earliest jazz figure, earliest period of jazz, and earliest jazz recordings. And also he talked about all different kinds of music influence which later established new music which formed jazz music. We talked about the birth of jazz and the origins and music influence from West African and European music. And that's it for today. Thank you.